Scream came out in 1996, and again in 2022. This second iteration was the first of the franchise to not be directed by Wes Craven, but even without the horror icon at the helm, still managed to perform well at the box office. A little bit of a preamble. I did not watch any of the previous movies in close proximity to watching this movie. I have very fond memories of the 96 film, more vague recollections of the preceding two, and am honestly unsure of whether or not I even saw the fourth one. If any of the following doesn't mesh with the events in those movies, I don't know, email me or something. Regardless of my recollections of the movies that predate it, another Scream movie came out in 2022 and is currently on Netflix, so I figured why the hell not. The movie begins with an homage to the first film, a teenager alone in a house, waxing philosophically about the finer points of horror films. This ends poorly for her, as is to be expected, and she gets stabbed. She doesn't die, but still, being stabbed is probably not very fun. Following this, we're promptly introduced to our cast of characters. Sam, sister of Tara, the stabbing victim, and her boyfriend Richie, and eventually a group of high schoolers that serve as the supporting cast. Sam and Richie travel to the hospital to visit with Tara, and it is eventually revealed to us that the sisters are daughters of Billy Loomis, who perpetrated the act of violence that took place in Woodsboro all those years ago. With the police being less than helpful, Sam and Richie decide that it's best to seek the aid of someone who will, David Arquette. At first, Mr. Arquette is reluctant to help, but in the end, he decides that it's his duty or something like that. Before he joins up, though, he makes sure to let Courtney Cox and Neve Campbell know that Ghostface is back and tells them to stay away. The teens, along with Sam and Richie, now have an exposition session. The group discusses the motifs of the particular horror movie in which they find themselves, and it becomes abundantly clear that this is a requel, not a sequel, and not a remake, but instead a chimeric aberration of the two. During this powwow, Sam is accused of being the killer and storms off. Shortly after the meeting, the sheriff and her son, who is one of the aforementioned high schoolers, are attacked by Ghostface and both of them are killed. Sam arrives at the scene, followed shortly by David Arquette. Courtney Cox eventually also shows up. It doesn't take long for Sam and David to realize that all the police in town are at this crime scene and there is no one at the hospital protecting Tara, the next most likely victim. The two head to the hospital in order to protect Tara and ostensibly catch Ghostface. They arrive at the hospital but aren't quick enough, it would seem. Ghostface is already at the hospital and is terrorizing both Tara and Richie, who was allegedly informed of the situation by Sam and rushed to the hospital. During this ordeal, Ghostface calls Sam, telling her that he will only let one of the two live, but is cut off when the elevator doors swing open. David Arquette draws his gun and shoots the serial killer, allowing the protagonists to escape. Mr. Arquette does not flee with them, however. He is ardent in his belief that a double tap is required and catches not one, but two knives for his troubles. The two sisters have a heart-to-heart conversation and decide that the best course of action is to leave town. They inform Miss Campbell, who arrived at the scene shortly after the death of David Arquette, and Miss Cox that this is their intended course of action. And Miss Campbell and Cox bug the sisters' car, assuming that Ghostface will hunt down the two, and that this bug will lead the two legacy characters directly to the killer. For their parts, the sisters and Richie do have intentions on leaving town, but it would seem that Tara has misplaced her inhaler. Luckily, she has a backup at her friend Amber's house. As this device is medically necessary, the group heads in that direction. The house in question is currently occupied with partying teens, and during the soiree, the jock and his sister were both slain. When the group finds out about this, Amber reveals to the lot of them that she is the killer by shooting one of the other teens. The rest of the teens flee, and Courtney Cox and Neve Campbell arrive at the scene, but Amber shoots the former. The protagonists struggle to stay alive, and while doing so, it is revealed that Richie is the second killer. Apparently, he and Amber met online while discussing their displeasure with the previous Stab movie. They were so disgusted by this bit of cinema that they took it upon themselves to make a better one, thus leading to the events of the movie. Climaxes and both of the killers are eventually slain. None of the other legacy characters or main protagonists die, and both of these categories of characters live happily ever after, more or less. It is abundantly clear that the creators of this movie had watched the previous Scream movies at least twice. References and throwbacks abound as they slather every scene with an abundance of franchise references. Some might say that the slathering is a bit too severe, but more on that later. Legacy characters return, and non-legacy characters are related to legacy characters, as the writers set their sights squarely on the audience's nostalgia. The dialogue in this movie is actually solid. The lines are snappy and sharp without the bog-standard quippiness that abounds in many contemporary cinematic experiences. All of the performances were quite good as well, with the standout for me being Jack Quaid as Richie. But it wasn't just Mr. Quaid. All of the cast gave performances that were at least above average, and any gripes that I have with the movie are in no way related to the acting. Finally, the special effects in this movie were outstanding. The FX artist really struck the perfect balance when it comes to the amount of blood and guts to show on screen. Not so much that it becomes the focal point of the movie, but just enough to let the audience know that they are indeed watching a slasher. Look, you see the Mousebuster on screen. You can probably guess how I feel about remakes and bloated franchises and the like, but I swear I went into this movie with an open mind. After all, if there's a franchise that is capable of making a serviceable remake, it would probably be Scream. That being said, this movie really just didn't do it for me. As much as there are no shortage of nods to the '96 film, I feel like the writers really only understood half the assignment. Yes, the Scream franchise is known for its horror references, but I feel like the only horror films that this movie really referenced were other horror films in the Scream franchise. Sure, they said the titles of other horror movies, but is this really what passes for an homage these days? Besides the meta references, I feel like another thing that makes Scream great is its ability to subvert expectations. Look at the scene with Miss Barrymore in the '96 film. This is ostensibly one of the most famous actresses of the time and was featured very prominently in the advertising of the film, only to be killed off in the first scene. That immediately throws the audience for a loop and sets them off kilter, and it's such a risky move from a marketing perspective that paid off wildly. Juxtapose that with Miss Ortega's opening scene. The scene is obviously harkening back to the Barrymore bit, and yeah, the character does get assaulted, but she lives and undercuts the entire scene. There is no risk here, therefore there is no reward. We just get another unremarkable opening where the protagonist escapes by the skin of their teeth. They make up for this slightly by killing off David Arquette later in the film, but this is only a subversion of expectation because all the moments leading up to this are so utterly risk-averse, and seeing something vaguely unexpected happen is like finding an oasis in the desert. Earlier, I praised the dialogue in this movie, and I did mean it, at least for the bits where the characters were bantering back and forth. Those bits of writing were very good, and the banter was on point, but narratively, the writing does leave a bit to be desired. On more than one occasion, characters will have some big drama moment, and for a minute or two, the movie feels like it turned into a tearjerker. I don't believe that horror films should be utterly bereft of drama, but I feel like the writers of this movie went back to that well a bit too often, as many of these scenes just feel unnecessary and out of place. Another critique I have of the movie is that tonally, it feels more similar to a mystery than a slasher. I get that this is the nature of the franchise, and it's even remarked upon at one point, but there's very much an air of whodunit about the entire movie. I get it. With all the references to prior movies, this is somewhat par for the course. The movie is mirroring what happened all those years ago, so obviously one of the characters that we've already met is the killer, because that's how it was back in the day. But I feel like this movie leans into that a bit too much. It makes the audience spend their mental bandwidth trying to figure out who Ghostface is, rather than worrying about which character will survive. To further expand upon this point, the whodunit aspect wasn't even done it well. I called Richie as one of the killers about an hour into the movie. This had nothing to do with Mr. Quaid's performance, which I still say was exceptional, but more to do with the script he was given. Once the movie is firmly in mystery territory, anytime a character shows up in a place they shouldn't be, they're immediately a suspect. The writers could play on this by throwing red herrings in our direction, but it is already established that they do not know the meaning of subversion, so it follows that they would spoil a large portion of the twist halfway through the movie. As always, whether or not a movie is worth a watch is a largely subjective matter. Theoretically, some people like remakes, reboots, requels, or whatever, because if no one liked these kind of movies, why would they keep getting made? I, for one, am not one of those people. The cast in this movie was outstanding. The effects were great, as were parts of the writing. In my opinion, the Scream brand is just an anchor, dragging this movie to the icy depths of the ocean. Think of what a good horror movie could have been made with all the resources that were allocated to this one. Instead of that, we're just left with this masturbatory exercise in mediocrity. And honestly, the cinematic landscape doesn't need any more mediocre movies. It is with a heavy heart that I say this, but this movie probably isn't worth your time. Just wait until Scream 1996 comes on Netflix.